Tom Anderson, day 34 of 100 Days of Thankfulness. Today we're talking about the importance of accepting others. And also I want to talk about why I'm so thankful for a good friend of mine, Scott Bobbitt. Before I get started, I just want to share with you, I do have a couple of friends who are homosexuals, and it would be wrong of me to talk about accepting others without covering the idea of discrimination and bigotry, and at least talking a little bit about that. So discrimination can actually take many different forms. It includes, you could be discriminated against based on your race, your age, your gender, your disabilities, and there's a whole bunch of different disabilities, sexual orientation, religion, marital status, physical features, political beliefs or activities, pregnancy and breastfeeding, career and parental status, or really any other difference such as athleticism or your intelligence, whatever, or even your personal association with someone who has these characteristics. So that's a big list of things to be careful for, but really what you need to be more focused upon is this idea of bigotry, which is being intolerant towards those who hold different opinions from yourself. Now, I know I talked a few days ago about tolerance versus intolerance and right versus wrong, and certainly there are times where it's right to be intolerant, and I gave some examples of that, so I'm not going to go into that right now, but really the type of intolerance we're talking about here really has to do with almost like a deep-seated hatred for someone. You're never going to overcome hate with more hate. The solution to hate is love. Even Jesus talked about how we should love our enemies. And so in this, when we're talking about accepting others, it's not just believing what they believe, it's accepting what they believe. We all have different beliefs, but giving someone the appropriate amount of respect for their beliefs doesn't mean that you have to agree with them. It just means you have to accept them. So I'll give you, kind of an example to illustrate the difference there. And this is a purely hypothetical example. Let's say I invite my two friends to church with me, and we all get kicked out of the church, and they say, your two friends are homosexuals, they're actively gay, they don't belong here. That would be an act of discrimination and bigotry. Similarly, if I were to then go to a Bible study with them and they said, no, you can't be part of the Bible study, again, discrimination and bigotry. Even if they were to say to me, Tom, they can attend the Bible study, that's fine, maybe they'll learn something, but I'm not going to be your friend anymore. That would be discrimination and bigotry. What isn't discrimination and bigotry would be if I invited my two friends into the church and they were welcomed and accepted, and up on the screen pops up Romans 1:26-27, which are some Bible verses that condemn homosexuality. That's a statement of a belief. That is not saying to someone, we don't accept you, or we don't love you, or we don't appreciate you. That's no different than if instead of that popping up on the screen, there was Matthew 5:28, which says, but I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery. So on the topic of adultery, that kind of strikes at the core of, most guys I know, probably about 99% of guys struggle with that one. We don't look at that and say, well, we don't feel comfortable with you saying that, Jesus, so I think we should just get that removed from your Bible or removed from your belief system, because, this is just the way God made us. He made us to be visually affected by a woman's appearance. So I don't think that's right, that should be in the Bible, so let's take that out. That doesn't make any sense. the reality is what's stated in Romans 3:23, which says, "For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God." So every single person who goes to church, every single person who's sitting in the church recognizes that none of us are perfect. We're all human. We've all fallen short of the glory of God. So that being said, I've talked about Casey Franklin, who actually led me to Christ. He started a church called Inversion Community Church, and I love kind of the way that he illustrates it, and even the 4 core principles that he built his church upon. And he was inspired by God in this way. And it's this concept of acceptance, right? So most churches say, if you want to be part of our church, that's great, but you have to believe as we believe. And so they kind of draw this fence that says, either you're included or you're excluded. And I can certainly understand why a lot of churches would choose to do that. Now, Casey's Inversion Community Church is very different. So here's how he starts every service. It's and I just love this. Number 1, you are welcome just as you are, so just be yourself. Number 2, your thoughts are welcome and your doubts are welcome. Number 3, we are all in this together. Number 4, we believe that God is love, God is real, and God is here. So I just love that. I mean, that just really gets to the core of how we need to be welcoming, how we need to be accepting. Instead of a fence concept where you're either in or you're out, he is basically saying you're all in. There were people that, and when they were first meeting just at his house, and they were like social meetups that they were doing, there were people that, were asking him, so, they were just casually talking, so what is it that you do? And Casey shared with them that he's a pastor, and he's like, oh, wow, you'll never find me going to church or whatever, and Casey had to say, well, actually, you're in one right now. That's how accepting he was, so much to the point they didn't even realize they were already in it. So he illustrates it as, instead of a fence, you have a well, and at the well, people can either be far away from the well or they can be right up next to the well. But there's sort of this meeting, this congregating around the well, and the well in this case is Jesus. But it doesn't matter how close or how far you are from the well, you're not ever excluded. You're not ever outside of the fence. That's really, for God to decide anyways, who's in and who's out, right? It's not for any man that we should decide. So, I just love his concept. And, the reason that I actually mentioned Scott Bobbitt as part of this topic is I need to share with you something about him, and something more specifically about what was going on with me at the end of my depression before I moved away and went to college. Right after I was, wanting to move away, 3 hours away, I was in the middle of my sophomore year in college, and I was moving out to the University of Minnesota Morris, which was about 3 hours from home. And so this is really, I was I had just turned 20 years old, and I was finally moving out of the house and moving into a dormitory called Spooner Hall at University of Minnesota Morris. And the day before I had to drive out there, I was like really, really sick. I was, the whole day I was just throwing up constantly in the toilet. Like, I fell asleep several times on the bathroom floor, and I was running 104 temperature, and so it was just kind of really bad timing. But I waited till like the last possible moment to drive out there, and I drove out there kind of sick. I was feeling well enough to drive by the time by the next day. But when I got out there, I was getting there, and I had to get settled in quickly because the next day was classes. And most of the people, since this was in the middle of the year, this, this would have been like New Year's of 1990. Most of the students at Spooner Hall were freshmen. I was coming in the middle of my sophomore year, but they had already settled in. They had already made, their friends and whatnot. Well, the evening that I arrived there, kind of sick, one of the first people I met was Scott Bobbitt. He was actually there with James Grappentine, who I'll talk about him more tomorrow. But Scott was, kind of the first one on the scene, and he was just very welcoming and very accepting. I was kind of the new guy, the new kid. In the middle of the school year, there aren't too many new people, and so he introduced himself to me, and he welcomed me into. I don't think it was his dorm room; it was someone else's dorm room. But he was saying, "Hey, we're watching a movie," and he was there with James, and they were throwing popcorn, and we just had a really good time, despite me being a little bit sick. And as it turned out, I ended up getting the whole floor sick, so thanks for that. But the thing that I just so appreciate about that is I was at a very vulnerable point, where I had just gotten out of this depression, and I was coming on the scene not knowing anyone, and it could have gone many different ways. Scott Bobbitt, is always more of a party goer in college than I was, and he was still always very accepting towards me, and even to the point where later on, him and James and a bunch of other great guys that were on that floor, we ended up moving out and renting a house or the basement of a house, and we all, had very different personalities, very different, they were really into partying, and I don't know why they accepted me the way they did, but, I'm so thankful that they did, because I was always, in high school, I was always a bit of an outcast. I was always so shy, and not a lot of people knew me, and to be accepted and to, get these friendships formed so quickly right away was just so, incredibly important to me, especially at that particular point in my life. So with that, I just want to say thanks once again to Scott Bobbitt.